Welcome to Kevin Makes Cool Things. I'm Kevin, and today I am making an auto petter from Stardew Valley for the simple purpose of pranking my wife. For any of you that don't play Stardew Valley, an auto petter is a really useful piece of equipment which helps take care of your animals. Depending on your in-game decisions, this is either something you can get easily from a store or something you have to get as a random drop from a treasure chest. My wife and I both play, and we both went the route where you have to get this as a random drop. I've been lucky and actually have more of these than I need. My wife, on the other hand, is farther in the game than I am, but hasn't found a single one. Naturally, I make fun of her for this constantly, and thought a great way to take this running joke to the next level would be to actually 3D print one of these for her to find. Let's look at how that all started with the design. The auto petter consists of a set of spinning arms above a stationary base. I decided to use a bearing to allow these arms to spin freely, which was the most complicated part of the project. I ordered some small bearings off of Amazon and bought some matching metal rods. I'll post the measurements for all of this in the video description. I finalized the measurements in GIMP. This went pretty fast because I had already roughly sketched this out on some scratch paper while I was figuring out the dimensions. Aside from the hands, this is really just a few basic shapes. I will be importing this drawing into Blender so I have it handy, but unlike the daggers and swords I've been working on recently, I'm not going to need to trace over a detailed reference image. In Blender, I started modeling the hand. I'm trying to get better at this aspect of things, so I at least want to attempt it once from scratch. The results weren't terrible, but they weren't great. I probably could have gotten this to work with a few more attempts, but time was a factor. My wife was grinding Skull Cavern to get an auto petter, and this wasn't going to be quite as funny if she had already found one. I looked on Thingiverse for existing models with gloved hands, like we see on the auto petter. I started by looking at classic characters, like Mickey Mouse and Pinocchio, and found some good candidates, but I was looking for something very specific, where the hand was in the same position as the auto petter to minimize the number of changes I would need to make. Eventually, I found what I was looking for. I settled on a model of Tails from Sonic the Hedgehog. This was low poly, which was exactly what I wanted. Low poly means the model is made with a minimal mesh, so it looks quite blocky. You can see this in older video games, because that was all the technology could handle, and some people do like the aesthetic. The reason I like working with low poly models is they're much simpler and easier for me to manipulate. With my skill level, pretty much everything you see me do on this channel is low poly. The daggers I make for solo leveling, and the stuff I make for Stardew Valley is all very simple. And then I use the Subdivision surface modifier, which I rave about in all of my videos, to add details and complexity, which I could never do by hand. In this case, I'm going through the exact same process. Just instead of making that initial low poly model myself, I'm finding something existing on Thingiverse and leveraging that. I made some minor edges to the hand, scaled it so it was the right size, and applied a Subdivision surface modifier. The modeling went pretty quick after that. The bearing and rod were pretty easy to add with just a few cylinders and a difference modifier. I divide this into a few different pieces for printing to minimize the number of supports needed. I used a bit of finishing nail to align these two pieces while using some trusty 2-part epoxy to hold them together. This is the same opaque epoxy which caused me issues on my last two projects, so get ready for some more complaints later in the video. After some rough sanding with my Dremel tool, I covered these both with wood filler. I carefully sanded these with sandpaper and small files until they were looking pretty great. At this point, I decided to drill out the holes for the rod and bearing, which I really should have done earlier. These close up a bit during printing, so I used a set of metric drill bits to make sure everything's the right size and fits properly. This went fine for the spinning portion, but not nearly as well for the hole the bearing is supposed to fit in. I reattached the pieces and used wood filler to cover up the break. It turned out fine, but it was a really dumb mistake on my part. Next, I applied some spray-on sandable primer and did some cleanup. The fingers were a pain to work with, but I got decent results. Most of this is supposed to be wood, so I started by applying some brown paint. As a little aside, this is actually the same paint I used on my first project on this channel 3 years ago. It's getting a little old, but it still works. 3D printing can be expensive when you first start, because you have to buy the printer initially, but after that, it's a really cost-effective hobby. That's not so much an issue for me now, But I know a few years ago during the pandemic, I had a lot of time on my hands, but not a lot of money to spend on leisure. Doing these kinds of projects gave me a lot of bang for my buck. So if you're looking for a hobby that you can sink hours into without having to spend a ton of money, I recommend you check out 3D printing. Enough of that, let's get back to the painting process. For the hands, I went for an off-white. I don't think I've ever actually used plain white on any of my projects because it looks too harsh. I painted the cup separately and attached it using some 2-part epoxy. Unfortunately, some of the 2-part epoxy was visible, since this formula isn't clear, and I had to go back and do some touch-ups, just like my last 2 projects. I was trying to keep this all a secret from my wife, so for most of this project, this was hidden inside a roll of paper towels. I applied some spray on matte sealer to finish this off. I used a toothpick and some cardboard to suspend the spinning section while it dried, which worked great. I used a similar approach on the other piece. I inserted one of the metal rods into this and suspended it mid-air, so I could spray this all at once and not have to worry about holding it while it dried. I had trouble inserting the bearing and slipped up. I hit the cup and halfway broke it. I'm pretty sure the clear coat was the only thing holding it on there at this point. I never did get the bearing in there as well as I would have liked because I was scared of breaking this further. It does spin freely, so I'm going to call that a win because it's my first time adding parts like this to one of my prints. I placed this on my wife's tablet while it was charging and waited for her to start playing. I was finishing up some painting at the time, so ignore the plastic on the floor. At this point, I'm waiting in another room for my wife to come bursting in, demanding to know what I've done. 5, 10, then 15 minutes go by, and there is no sign of her. At this point, I'm starting to get very nervous, because something has obviously not gone as planned. I go and check on her, and she is happily playing Stardew in the other room. Her only question is, what is that doodad that was on her tablet? Was it some knickknack from my childhood that I found while cleaning up? The funniest thing here is since she had never found an auto-petter in game, she didn't actually know what one looked like. After I explained it to her, I got the outrage that I was expecting. In some ways, this was an even better result from the prank than I could have asked for. If you like this project and want to make your own, I'll post all the files on Thingiverse. There'll be a link in the video description. If you enjoyed this video, then go ahead and give it a like, and let YouTube's algorithm know it's worth watching. If you want to support the channel and see my other projects, then go ahead and subscribe.